Gray spoke to, I'm here to deliver on behalf of two members who wanted to speak, or two educators that wanted to speak their story. They urgently wanted their message delivered, but they did not want to do so while being identified. So I will read their stories verbatim. The first wrote, as a student growing up in Jeffco, being the minority in a school and not having teachers that looked like me was the norm. Becoming an educator of color in a district as large as Jeffco can be intimidating. My first year in the district as a special service provider at a more affluent school, I was delegated the position of a diversity liaison without even being asked. And I believe it was only because I was the one of two educators of color in the building. I didn't question this as I was brand new to the school setting, so I went with it. 2 years passed on my temporary contract, and with budget cuts and restructuring, I was bumped out of my position and I was back in the interview process. Following interview after interview, I finally found my home and permanent position. I shared my interview journey with my new principal, who was a white older male, and I told him about a school that I thought would have been a good fit for me with my experience in center programs in my previous schools and my previous career with teens with high-risk behaviors. Yet I was told by this school that they went with someone else and that I wouldn't have been, quote, wouldn't have been a good fit. This wording and rejection didn't feel right to me. My new principal shared, quote, you weren't a good fit there because you didn't look like them, but you wouldn't have liked it anyway, so it's their loss and my gain. In speaking my assumption out loud, he confirmed it. My next educator story comes from somebody who wanted to speak to her experience with the hiring and disciplinary process in Jeffco. Good evening. I would first like to state that my intentions were to tell my story in person, but after many discussions with family, friends, and colleagues, it was decided that it would be best for me to remain anonymous for fear of retaliation and persecution. To say that Jeffco is in my blood would be an understatement. I am a K-12 graduate of Jeffco. I have owned a business in Jeffco. I own my home, and I'm raising my family in Jeffco. So naturally, I felt it was an achievable goal to begin, advance, and end my educational career in Jeffco. However, it wasn't until a few years into teaching in Jeffco that I realized that advancing my career would be much harder than I imagined. Despite having 2 master's degrees, a principal's license, and over a decade of teaching experience, I've been overlooked for advancement in favor of others that have had less experience and credentials. Through all these rejections, I have chosen to ignore what I thought was the obvious answer as to being overlooked, which was my race. However, it wasn't until this last year that I could not ignore that feeling anymore. I wanted to speak about an incident that happened to me that changed my entire professional trajectory. I had an incident with a colleague in which I was falsely accused of making inappropriate comments in an interaction with him. It was a case of my word versus his, and he was a white male colleague. The building administrator, who was also white, took his word over mine and started the disciplinary process against me. This matter ended up being escalated up to HR, and I was shocked to find that the principal had completed a full investigation to the other educator side of the story, but had not consulted with me. She stated that in her opinion, the other staff member was trustworthy, and she knew him well because they worked closely together. Through the district disciplinary process, the HR representative, a white woman, dismissed my side of the story, commenting that it had been her experience that people, such as my colleague, who have had an interaction with another teacher such as this, do not forget the details in such clear form and therefore are considered reliable. Fortunately, indisputable evidence surfaced which proved that the claims made against me were entirely false. After the introduction of this evidence, the process was halted, but it took several weeks for the conclusion to the reprimand, during which I felt high levels of anxiety, stress, and I was unable to sleep. Following the conclusion, I was never provided an apology from any of the other 3 parties involved, and neither my colleague or administrator faced any repercussions. The administrator for her mishandling of the process, and my colleague for his false accusations. To say that justice prevailed would be a gross overstatement. I have applied for administrative positions in the district and been passed over, and have been given feedback from a trusted administrator that referenced that they have heard, quote, concerning discussion from their peers about the way that I interact with others. The administrator followed up and suggested that if I were planning to advance my career, that perhaps I should look to another district, as it is not likely that I would ever be hired in this district. What I took from this was that the untruths have been spread about me, and that my innocence is a moot point. I am appalled by the idea that I can be considered a bad person without any actual proof, and that despite being exonerated through the disciplinary process, these false accusations can still be used as an excuse not to hire a person of color for advancement in their career. I am left to ask, why? In closing, I feel a level of anxiety every day when I imagine what would have happened had I not found the evidence that proved my innocence. How many other teachers of color in our district have been treated unfairly like me and couldn't protect themselves? It sickens me to think about any of this at all, but this is now my reality. I have been repeatedly asked by family and friends, why don't you just go to another district rather than keep dealing with the inequities and discrimination? And my response is, why should I have to be the one who leads? This is my Jeffco. Also, the JCA emote team has held ongoing listening tours with educators of color since last summer, hosting both JCA member educators as well as non-member educators, and we wanted to elevate some of their stories tonight to describe their experiences in Jeffco. One educator commented that, quote, compared to other large urban districts I have worked in, Jeffco is slow and behind in racial equity considerations. They don't seem to recognize the need for the staff to represent the student population. In my time with the district, Jeffco has slowly gotten better, but the administration doesn't seem to understand the urgency for equity work. My building administration seems like they don't want to acknowledge that there are equity issues, and they will dismiss concerns until they repeatedly hear the same thing from multiple parties. Concerns I raised about inequities in student achievement data in my building was summarily dismissed. I feel that I do not have a voice, and for the district to say that they have a commitment to collaboration and equity feels like only paying lip service.